Good day. This is Jim Winship for Diplomatic Connections magazine. We're glad you're joining us today. And our guest is the newly arrived Austrian ambassador to the United States, Dr. Hanz Mr. Ambassador, welcome to Washington. Tell us a little bit, if you can, just about your own diplomatic background. We talked earlier, I was surprised to see the Austrian ambassador was born in Australia. I thought perhaps you spelled it incorrectly.
No, for once, although we are usually proud that we are the country where we have no kangaroos, the fact is that my parents were in the diplomatic business already, so I got imported as a half-finished product into Australia in 1955, and then was born there and spent the first 4 years of my life in Australia. No memories, no real memories. I mean, what I have is basically home movies that now become ingrained as a personal memory. I think for like most kids, that's the way it is. Or I have to wait to get a lot older so all these memories come back. I don't know. We'll see about that. But no, I'm a career diplomat for now more than 32 years. And I've gotten around a little bit. I had early postings in Switzerland and in Iran in the mid-80s. So a few years after the revolution, quite an interesting time to be there, and one that was very enlightening, and also I think not without interest in current times. Then came back for a relaxing job on the Eastern European West in 1987, when it was still the
when walls were starting to fall.
Not yet. No, 87 was still. We still thought that was business as usual, basically.
Yeah.
Reading between the lines, watching these pictures from Red Square who had been taken out of the last parade picture or something like that. But as we know, starting in 1988, the whole thing started moving, and so until 1991, when I left again, it was quite a hectic period, but also, of course, a very, very, very interesting period. And then after another short spell in Switzerland, I became the Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations in New York. Spent 5.5 fascinating years working at the UN and living in New York. And then I went back to Vienna and ended up as the so-called diplomatic advisor to the Federal Chancellor, our Prime Minister, for more than 6 years, including a presidency of the European Union and lots of other stuff. So that was really, there were lots of things, especially dealing with the aftermath of 9/11, obviously. That was a major issue for the whole world. And also being responsible for the Washington Agreement and its follow-up on our relationship and our closing the gaps and deficiencies of post-war restitution and compensation agreements to the victims of Nazi rule. And then finally they let me go again outside back to my real career. And I served as ambassador to Switzerland since 2007. And in beginning of December, I started here in DC. And of course, I couldn't have come at a better time. Politically speaking, for a political junkie, as I would like to describe myself.
Right. I know that feeling.
The perfect time to be here.
Yes.
And especially since it gives you enough to write about without actually knowing what you're talking about. So, just joking, but
it's
what I mean.
Easy to fill the dispatch bag going home.
It's easy, and it gives you time to get into American politics in general a little deeper before hopefully become valuable.
Well, as you're learning, American political season goes on perpetually, it seems now. I used to live in Iowa, and believe me, with the Iowa caucuses, presidential campaigns never ended, I think, there. But Ambassador, how does Austria's position at the heart of Europe? I think for many Americans, forgive me the stereotype, but there is still the Sound of Music image of Austria, which is not inaccurate, but it's far from the fullness of Austria's identity. But can you tell us a little bit about how Austria's position, sort of at the heart of Europe, really shapes its foreign policy?
Yeah, this is an interesting question because until, let's say, 1988, 1989, that was one of the cliches that we were using. I mean, you were talking about Sound of Music, which is a cliche, which has a large grain of truth, as we all know. And then we had, this sort of bridge function, or whatever it was called. And I remember clearly that our former president, Klestil, always said that you can't live on a bridge. So that was very true. But it was this very special situation between the blocs. That the after-war period brought Austria into the neutrality situation between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So it was, by definition, already a situation in between two worlds, so to speak. And that formed Austrian foreign policy for a long time. But I think this has changed fundamentally since we joined the European Union in 1995, and with the opening of Central and Eastern Europe, and most of the countries becoming members of the Union themselves. Yes, we are more than ever at the heart, but no longer a bridge in that sense. I do think we are still driven by the special relationship that we have with our neighbors. Obviously, we share an enormously long history and I think a very good understanding of each other, which for some, let's say, more traditionally Western European countries is harder to come by. So we serve that function still, and we tried very hard. I think during the years when our neighbors started their negotiations for accession, when they were reforming their administrations and their laws and so forth, we assisted wherever we could. And in that sense, I think this special relationship is still there, and this sort of intermediary function. But now that they're all in and full-fledged partners, I think our foreign policy is more in line with the common European foreign policy. And we try then, of course, to use the niches that we have outside that, where we have special bilateral interests to move on. But I think that we have become much more international, no longer fixed so much on our immediate environment. Obviously, the security threat is much less than it was during the Cold War. And of course, the economic world has changed so enormously. With the so-called globalization, which I think is a misnomer anyway, but it has accelerated to a point that now it is quite normal for our companies as well to look to the Far East, to become more engaged in the Americas and so forth. And this is, I think, a very good sign. So in that sense, the importance of our geographic situation for our foreign policy has diminished to a certain extent.
What you said, I can't let it go by, that globalization was a bit of a misnomer. You want to explain that comment?
No, because I mean, it's very catchy, but I think it's always been there. If you look at European history, I mean, the very discovery and then colonization of the Americas, for instance, that's globalization. I mean, this is what our forefathers already did. What is meant, of course, is international labor sharing. Trying to work on a free market system based on a global economy, and we're, I think, far away from that. In a completely, it's not completely free, despite the best efforts that we've done through the WTO and many other and its precursors in GATT and so forth. But we have of course a larger competition, and the world, given the new technology, has shrunk, so to speak. Everything's happening a little faster. Things that were very far away are now very close by. That's quite clear. So the interdependence may have grown, but we've always, as exponents of Western culture, whether European or American, we've always done that. This is nothing, in that sense, nothing new.
So globalization as a phenomenon is really not anything new, and globalization
as
a goal is a place we haven't reached yet.
Not at all. I think it has become, I would say, a misnomer. Has become a catchword because it's easier to oppose, an idea that can be summed up in one word. It has become, in some parts of the political spectrum, a curse word in reality. But the fact of life is that you neither can stop it nor should we. This is absolutely impossible. Hardly any European country, at least, has enough natural resources or energy resources to be autonomous. It doesn't happen. Even the United States, with all its riches, it cannot be completely autonomous. So globalization is a natural thing to happen. And that, therefore, I mean, I'm always a little reticent to use these package names, so to speak, because the problems are in fact much more complex and can be summed up in a single idea.
Now, talking about globalization, I had thought about this question later, but let me ask it now, because I was struck to see that Austria is commemorating the 100th anniversary, so 1812 or 1912, of its law on Islam. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I think that, to me that was a bit surprising, even though when you explain the history, it makes good sense to me.
Yes, I mean it has, as you said, it has historical roots which go back to the Habsburg Empire when the Habsburg Empire annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1912. The law was passed because in the system of state church law that we had in the empire, that was absolutely necessary to regulate that situation. Before that, there were no big groups of Muslim citizens in the empire. So, and you know that historically there had always been the fight against the Turkish Empire, and therefore against the Muslims.
Yes.
So recognized purely as Turks at the time. Now with Bosnia and Herzegovina, suddenly you had an autochthonous Islamic population inside the empire, so it had to be regulated. These guys were great administrators. It had to happen. And this goes back, this idea, this setup goes back, let's say, to the times of Emperor Joseph II, when they started finally to go away from the Catholic monoculture and then recognizing other religions, but under a certain set of state rules. So this is why that happened this early. And we're very happy about this, because it has a very clear and simple setup for the relationship between the state and the recognized religions. And that works fine, that's great. So we're quite happy to have it. I think it would be much more complicated.
So how has it adapted to the modern time?
It works very nicely. It works very nicely. You know, it is much like the law that regulates the relationship with the Jewish community in Austria. It structures an administrative setup that says that you have to have one board basically representing all Muslims, whatever their individual faith or particular part denomination may be inside the larger structure, so that the government has one board and a president on top of it as a partner. And so it helps on the one side, it allows the religion to self-govern, and on the other hand, it forces that religion to come up with with one position that they can, if they want something from the state. And this is important if you're talking about education in schools, about church guidelines and stuff like that, as far as building guidelines and so forth.
And essentially, the law is more or less the same for each of the religions.
In structure, yes, it is. Of course, it has given the different setups. Obviously, it is different in detail, but the whole idea about the relationship between the state and religion is the same as a guiding principle. There are historic differences as far as the Catholic Church are concerned, because that has a different set of regulations, because we have, of course, a treaty with the Holy See and so forth. It's a little different. But there you have an international partner in terms of international law, one partner that you can actually have a treaty with. But with the structure of world Islam, there is no such
there's no Vatican.
There's no Vatican. There's no Pope that you can deal with.
Yes. Now, you mentioned the relationship between Austria and the Jewish community, and I know you've been very active already here in Washington in reaching out to the American Jewish community. Bluntly, Austria has a history that, going back to the Anschluss, to the later on to the Holocaust and the Shoah, the relationship between how has Austria sought to both deal with its history and deal with the present in terms of its relationship with the Jewish community?
Yes, I mean, as you mentioned, this is one of the most delicate issues that you can face, given the burden of history that is there. There's no doubt about that, and I'm acutely aware of that. as I mentioned before, I had the pleasure to work on this particular dossier during my time with the Federal Chancellor. And so I got maybe more deeply immersed than other people with a group of highly competent colleagues in different places in Vienna. And so my personal motivation, I think, is very clear. This is one of the reasons that even just having arrived here, I already tried to establish contacts, which I think are absolutely necessary and, of course, increasingly normal these days. But I have said publicly that this will never go away. This is something that whatever you do, however much outreach there is, however much the government has done to create what Steve Eisenstadt called imperfect justice. And I think that's a very good term for what has happened. It can never come close to erasing the terrible things that have happened. So we have to be aware of that. We have to be aware that this will never go away. This is part of our collective consciousness, if you so like, of our common memory. But I think we have reached a point where we can now finally talk about it freely, in the sense that the generation after the war, I think, had a lot of problems dealing with that, because it was very much a mixed bag. I mean, you had people who were very actively involved in the Nazi machine. You had people who might have done something but didn't. You had others who just looked away, and probably very few people who really, honestly can say they never knew about what had happened because of, wherever they were geographically, it was not possible to know. But most people knew something bad was going on, maybe not in detail, but and nobody stood up. And I think it serves as an example of how quickly a civilization can break down. Unfortunately, we've seen this a number of times after that, and without questioning the uniqueness of the Holocaust, but we have seen the mechanisms involved later on, whether in Rwanda, whether in former Yugoslavia and stuff like that, how quickly the social tissue can break down if somebody tells you your neighbor is suddenly your enemy because he has a different color, a different religion, whatever. And how quickly that turns into bloodshed and the most unspeakable cruelty. So I think this is more than an issue of sort of making nice weather for Austria with the Jewish community, wherever it is, whether at home or here. I think it is more an issue of drawing the lessons for the future, because if we are serious about that our commitment to never again, then we have to keep working at it. This is not something you can put aside into a box and say this is history.
Right, it's more than just remembering. There's an active learning.
There is an active learning. You have to hand it over to new generations, particularly since young people today have no living memory, even of the Cold War. I mean, if you have a typical college graduate now in whatever his mid-20s, he or she will not have a living memory of the Cold War, of the Iron Curtain. That's ancient history, and the Second World War is probably on the same level as Hannibal crossing the Alps,
without the elephants,
or Columbus, discovering Haiti or whatever. This is really a thing that we have to be careful to hand on in the proper way. On the one hand, not making it just a piece of traditional history that nobody really thinks about. And on the other hand, not trivializing it by too much commercialization, I suppose. There was a certain period a couple of years ago where I was very much afraid that we were going in that direction. It seems to have righted itself again. But yes, it is an issue that even today many people are not very comfortable with. There's no doubt about that. And the truth of the matter is that despite all our efforts, there will never be again that cultural interchange that we had before the war. Because simply the numbers are not there. The Jewish community in Vienna is maybe a tenth or a little bit more than what it used to be before 1938. So the damage is irreversible. Not only the human and material cost to the victims themselves immediately, but I think to even to world culture.
Yes. Okay. Talking about the sort of the transformative power of history, Austria adopted as a sort of centerpiece of its foreign policy a policy of perpetual neutrality, I think is the language, back in 1955. How does that translate into your country's foreign policy decisions? I know, for example, you agreed to overflights during the recent Libya operations, and that you participated in Afghanistan, that you've participated in some of the UN peacekeeping operations. So functionally, in the second decade of the 21st century, what does perpetual neutrality mean?
No, again, historically, I think in Austria we prefer to call it permanent neutrality. This is a term from international law because, as you know, I'll start from the very beginning because it's an easy concept. If you have a war going on, any country is faced with the question whether how to behave during that war, whether to take a particular side and become a party, or to remain neutral. Now, permanently neutral means only that you promise not to involve yourself in any war that is happening, in any armed conflict. So we declared that in a way that was the political necessity to regain our sovereignty after 10 years of occupation by the four Allied powers that had won the Second War. And it was a window of opportunity because historians now believe that after the death of Stalin in '53, the new Soviet leadership wanted to pursue the goal of basically neutralizing Central Europe, to get it away from NATO as far as possible, to create a belt, sort of a buffer zone between the blocks. And they offered this opportunity to withdraw from Austria. We're the only country where the Red Army ever left before 1989, but that's what will happen. So the idea was to create a neutral zone, but of course the target would have been Germany in particular, because that's what they didn't want, that Germany would become part of the Western Bloc. So we had this window of opportunity when there was this, sort of easier time in Moscow, and mostly in that, and our guys came up with the idea of offering permanent neutrality as a token, so to speak, and saying if we have a state treaty, if we can get out of the occupation system, then we will declare permanent neutrality, which we did as soon as the soldiers had left. And it entered into force on the 26th of October 1955, which is and remains our national day. And it was a very important part, but in the same year we were allowed to become members of the United Nations. And I think that has always been a particular point. We never understood neutrality to mean that we would stay out of foreign policy as a whole. And you were mentioning our participation in peacekeeping operations, which started very early in the 1960s already in Congo. We've always held that a decision by the UN Security Council entailing sanctions or even military operations transcends normal neutrality laws, because it is the highest body in international law. This is a decision by the Security Council is binding. So it is in that sense not a war, but a police action, and therefore you cannot be neutral in a police action because it's right against wrong. There is no decision of who is right and who is wrong if the Security Council has spoken. So therefore we never had a problem in applying Security Council resolutions, and also never had a problem in participating in peacekeeping operations. We still would have a problem in participating in peace enforcement operations. We've never done that so far. Never know what happens in the future, but so far we've always held that there is a distinction. Once peacekeeping, of course, implies that you have at least a ceasefire or something in place, and that you are controlling that. Yes, Austrian troops have been involved also in firefights and stuff like that during that, but not on a regular basis. But they were never, part of a group that went into any country, even if there had been UN Security Council coverage for that. So that was always held to be compatible. And the next big challenge, of course, was becoming a member of the European Union. So today, the agreement of our international lawyers and Austrian politics is that clearly within the European Union we stand to our obligation to support each other. So there is no neutrality if you are part of the same family. But it still applies to third country relations. So that's the main reason, and it boils down to not allowing foreign troops to be stationed in the country. That is the case. We never joined NATO. There are no foreign troops on Austrian soil. We still only allow overflights and transportation through the country in the case of a valid Security Council resolution. And so we don't join any military pact, no troops in the country, and therefore if you have a conflict, I don't know, outside the European theater, so to speak, we remain neutral, which we would do anyway because we are not a world power. any sort of intervention going on.
You are active members of the OSCE,
however.
Yes,
yes, of course. But OSCE as such is as you know, an organization that works at the maximum at the principle of consensus minus one. So this is not a question of being outvoted or anything like that, and it doesn't have any of the powers that the UN has. I mean, it's very valuable. On its different pillars, it's very active in election observation, human rights, and other things, freedom of the press, and it's still a good meeting forum between East and West, too, because it's of course much larger than EU Europe, but it does not have any structures that entail any problem for Austrian neutrality at all.
Let me shift gears a little bit and ask you what you see as some of the major issues, primary issues between the United States and Austria at this point as you assume your role here.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately at the moment we have no major issues, which I think has a number of reasons for that. Many of the things that we would be dealing with bilaterally, we are now handling together through the European Union. I mean, a lot of things that are going on. If you're looking about whether it's this ETS, the airline pollution issues, whether it's data transfer, all these technical issues we are now handling together because it makes sense. I mean, most of these issues are economic today. Political issues, fortunately, there are none. I think we are still a valuable partner when we are talking about developments to the east of Austria, because our American friends still value our input on that. And since we resolved the issue of the assets post World War II, we have had no major political issue open with the United States. So we cooperate on many issues, but there's no one outstanding thematic issue that would drive us forward at the moment. And I hope that's the way it stays anyway, because it would probably mean that there's a problem rather than any particular area of cooperation. But I think that in general we are working hard inside the Union and also in our efforts here in working this out, because my feeling is that we are drifting apart, either through a lack of interest, but also, and this lack of interest entails a misunderstanding about how things work on both sides of the Atlantic, and that I think is a very sad situation. I feel that we face a number of common challenges in the future that will affect us both. There is no way that America wins if Europe loses, and vice versa.
Explain to me what you mean about the idea of a misunderstanding about how things work.
No, I think this has been a hallmark of the way the European Union is seen from this side of the Atlantic. That on the one hand, there is this understanding that we are somehow a United States counterpart, which doesn't work because there is no such thing as a president that really can commit the Union one-on-one if he talks with the President of the United States. It is of course not fully formed because the European Parliament does not have the same sort of powers that Congress has and so forth. And on the other hand, of course, the very fact that that is the matter always helps to derail whatever we're doing in the Union, because if necessary, then the president will call one of the big players in Europe and try to get things done bilaterally. Or you have a situation where you create something like the G20 group with just a couple of the European leaders and so forth. So the view from over here is that this is a sort of a construct that is not really doing what it should be doing, that it makes life complicated, that is basically anti-American. There's also this view, as exacerbated now, of course, by the campaign here.
Yes.
This is basically a socialist setup.
Europe has virtually become an epithet in the campaign at this point.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, and that's what I say misunderstanding, because the funny thing is, if the guys who talk about this were actually going to Europe and look at it, find out how it works, they might actually be quite impressed what can be done. On the other hand, there is no doubt that the American system is very innovative and creates a lot more energy and has a lot more, I think, potential to explode positively than the very regulated European setup can do. There's a price you pay for everything. I mean, we may have a higher degree of internal security, if you so like, because that's what our voters want, but it also means that we're probably less dynamic. So there's always a payoff. But in the end, I think that the bickering that we see, or have seen now for a couple of years, is useless, because, as I say, the challenges we are facing are not between us. It's not as if we were competing for the same resources or for the same markets. It's simply not true. I think what we are facing is a common challenge to our values that we have defended now for decades. If you look at how often now the universality of human rights is questioned in international fora under the pretext of cultural rights and stuff like that. This is going to be, I think, a much bigger challenge for both of us than we now acknowledge, and therefore I think it is necessary to overcome these relatively minor problems that we have between our organizational structures, if you so like, and say, okay, we have bigger problems than we have to tackle. And the world is, I think, much more complex. You cannot reduce it to one or two causes. It's not just there is the Chinese, or there is climate change, and there is this and that. It's everything together. So this is extremely complex, and I think we do have the tools to deal with it. We've got to use them.
Yes. That provides a perfect lead-in for the question that I promised myself I would wait till mid-interview to ask, of course. And that's your assessment of the Eurozone financial crisis and the efforts both to finance a bailout for Europe's alien economies and to reach final agreement on some new fiscal treaty that would make individual countries' budgets subject to stricter monitoring by the EU.
Yeah. No, I think again, this is an issue where we have a lot of smoke and a lot of noise around some real problems. But this has become a free-for-all now, where let me put it that way. I'm a lawyer by training, so by definition, I do not accept that economics is any kind of science as such.
All right.
I don't want, yeah, it sounds facetious. In any case, the point is that now you have at least a dozen different views of what's happening, uttered with the utmost sincerity and conviction. And you can take your pick, whatever you like. You can listen to Krugman or you can listen to other guys, and everybody has a completely different doomsday scenario, whichever side. But we should look at the facts. The facts are that fundamentally Europe is no worse off, in most cases better off than the United States economically today, fiscally and economically. The crisis is not about the euro as such. We have in some countries a sovereign debt crisis, and in the case of Greece, a very severe sovereign debt crisis. But Greece's economic importance to the EU as a whole is very limited. It's 2% of the European GDP. That's basically nothing. So even a default for Greece would not endanger the European economy per se. in real terms. But of course, if financial markets then continue to say, well, if this falls, that's for domino effect, we all know what might happen. The real problem is that we have not managed on either side of the Atlantic to deal with the aftermath of basically the housing crash in the United States that led through the derivatives market to a crash in the financial system. And that means that there's lots of money floating around that doesn't really know where it wants to go. We've seen a lot of that capital invested in European government bonds. And with the situation that we have, with rating drops and things like that, basically driving up the return on investment on government bonds, which traditionally, of course, have a very low return on investment, were driven up because of different issues in the ratings and doomsday scenarios and stuff like that, but they are still being paid off to a very high degree. So in fact, it's you get something for nothing. You still have 100% security T-bond, and then you get
sure. I mean, that was always the trade-off for the low return was the security of the bond.
Exactly. Now you have both. Now you have a European guarantee that all these bonds will be paid back, and of course, you have to hope that the so-called market forces, which are very intelligent, as we're always told, will know where the point of no return is, because you can only just pressure that issue to a certain point. Then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But the efforts in Europe to deal with it, I think, have been A, very serious, B, quite successful. The analysts have always then tried, whenever we did something, saying this is too little and it's not. So seeing how much further European governments might be pushed, but in the end, I think the result is quite okay. Of course, and this is something that goes back to what I said earlier, given the construction of the Union, it does not react as quickly and as easily as say, the United States could react in a situation like that if you had bipartisan support on the Hill.
Right.
If you had a national...
That's a big if.
No, it might be a big if, and it's not for me to work on that, but the point's taken. The point is taken that if there is a national emergency where everybody gets together here and they say we do have to do something, then you could do it very quickly, very concisely, very strictly, with the President and Congress working together. This could be passed, this could work, the Fed would come in and everything, these things would be dealt with. In Europe you have to play with 25, 26, 27, depending on the setup, and in the Eurozone case 17 players that have to agree, and they have their own little problems, and they also have their own domestic constituencies that have to deal with this. And if you can criticize the German government for not being forward enough. But on the other hand, these people have to be re-elected at some point in time. Right. So it makes it more complicated. I'm very convinced that we are on the right track. A lot of things have been done already, and we are proceeding now on this new setup for the Eurozone, which I think is a good thing. And it's also, I was in more than 20 European councils as an advisor. So I know how difficult it is to get to any sort of agreement, even on much less contentious issues, on the one hand. And on the other hand, it is, I think, clear that the mistakes that were made in Europe go back to before the financial crisis in reality, because even in a few years after the millennium, the rules of the so-called Maastricht criteria that would have forced the Commission to send letters to governments when they were overstepping the marks were broken. I mean, two major players in the European Union stopped the Commission from doing that in 2003. And I think that was a signal that then let other governments go into a rather loose handling of the situation, which was then, of course, exacerbated by the financial crisis. But I personally find it tragic that the very financial institutions that we saved with the taxpayers' money are now biting the hand to fix them. That is something that I think upsets me more than the point that we finally pay the bill for living beyond our means, because this is what happened. I mean, we were always saying, we can write checks on the future, basically draw checks on the future.
Right.
Which is okay as long as you're growing steadily at a quite important rate, but of course that hasn't been true for the last 20 years or so, because the post-war boom had to end at some point, as
Of
any
course,
as all economies sort of flatten out near the top of their development. And I think that's one of the reasons people. I mean, it's difficult for governments to stop the spending habit. You know that better than anybody here, and it's very difficult to tell people now they have to tighten their belts.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the point at which international politics starts to become domestic politics.
All politics is local. I think this has never been truer.
That's very true. Very, very true. What? Let me shift gears a little bit and ask you about a couple of specific international situations that have been and continue to be difficult. Early in your career, you mentioned that you served in Iran, and Iran and its development of a nuclear program have become a sort of conundrum for the international system at this point. What is Austria's position here, especially in a world where the cry for some sort of direct action against Iran grows stronger by the day, it seems?
Yeah, I mean, I personally think that the situation has become extremely difficult. I mean, there's no question that after the Islamic Revolution, it is part of the Iranian textbook, so to speak, that it's them against the world. You know? You have to realize that the Iranian position is that they are truly exceptional, that they are a chosen people in a way, and especially if you add this to religious fervor, religious regime, then it becomes even more so. And it is, of course, in a very important strategic position between many countries interested in that area, and they've made, with their policies, enemies of basically everybody, of their neighbors, and trying to export the Islamic Revolution, with their meddling also in the Middle Eastern peace process, of trying to derail that by supporting certain groups, and so forth and so forth. Clearly, we are not getting anywhere with the policies that we've followed so far, but there are really no alternatives. The issue, I mean, we as Austrians, of course, are very much anti-nuclear in any case, so we would be more than happy to see the nuclear program stopped. Whether that can be done by sanctions, political pressure, and so on, we don't know. We can hope that the pressure that has been put there and the concurrent offer of getting back to the negotiating table, we can only hope that that works. In general, we do not support the use of force as a valid tool of international policy, but we know that the discussion is out there, and we hope it doesn't get to that point, really. Clearly, if there is an effort to close the Straits of Hormuz or something like that, then it might become inevitable. Personally, I believe they will not go that far, because basically it would mean cutting off their own legs. They need the Straits of Hormuz just as much as anybody else to get any sort of export going.
Yes.
So this would be a very desperate measure to take. It's more, I was there during the war between Iraq and Iran, when Iran were the good guys versus an Iraqi aggression. And I noticed that there is a very particular way that that wars or military confrontations are done in the Middle East. So there is also a lot of posturing, and these demonstrations that they were doing, these maneuvers in the Straits, and also the threats that were uttered against American naval presence and stuff like that. That is for show only. Of course, as a military man, you have to take them seriously. And every time you have to be prepared that it might get hot, but most of the time, you just have to keep your cool and show, on the other hand, that you're not intimidated, which is something the US Navy, I think, can do very well, and did by simply sending an aircraft carrier through to make sure that they would not be impressed by these boats, and that's it. It's part of the game, so to speak. But it's a clear danger. And on the other hand, Iran is a huge country that does not lend itself easily to military intervention, as Saddam found out when he attacked in the aftermath of the Islamic revolution in Iran, hoping that they would be in disarray and that people were so upset about the takeover by Khomeini that they basically would come over to him, at least that he would carve out the piece of Iran that is known as Arabistan, given its mixture of population, and of course oil fields and stuff like that. That's what he was hoping for, to carve that out, and it didn't work out because once he came and attacked, even the enemies of the regime were rallying around the flag, which is what always happens, which is that one of the dangers that I see in putting even more pressure on Iran. I know from personal experience that this is a very, very resilient population. The sanctions will hit them, but they're used to that. Unless there is a complete breakdown in the food chain or whatever, then it will not. It will take a long time to be really felt. I think and the idea that you can close down the borders, basically that they would not be able to get things out to finance themselves. Given the knowledge in the region, I don't think that is realistic. It's just not happening.
If you look at the number of small boats in the Strait of Hormuz going back and forth every day and night,
there are many thousands of kilometers of borders that you cannot control. Even if all the neighbors wanted to do that, which I'm not so sure that all of them would.
Of course.
I mean, yes, prices will go up. It will be a little bit more difficult, but I can only tell you that when I was there, it was possible to buy whiskey in Tehran, where on the label it said "bottle for Iraqi front troops." So that shows you what was really going on in those days. And there's not only one bottle that by accident happened to arrive there, but the Iraqi front troops got so much whiskey that they were selling it to the Kurdish groups, who then smuggled it across the border and sold it on the black market in Tehran. So and that at the time. Today, I think it's even easier because technology has advanced. So far, if you look at all that, if you look at the problems in Balochistan on the Pakistani borders, in Iran, which is basically out of control of anybody at the moment, as it seems. Looking
it has been for decades.
Yes, but it's even now. I think even the Pakistani government acknowledges that this is a real, really brigand's paradise in a way. I don't think you could control in any way the flow of goods and so forth. Whether that is enough to have any substantial oil exports going, I don't know. But at least they would not be completely without possibility of earning some foreign currency. So it would take an enormously bad management decision by the Iranian government, and so far they've proven very astute of running their own country or keeping their regime in power. I'm not optimistic that this is going to work, but I acknowledge, of course, that we have no choice. I mean, we cannot stand by and say simply because it's unlikely that we will just get a quick result, we should stop doing anything. This is also quite clear. So we are part of the sanctions that were expanded recently by the European Union.
Yes.
I mean, we clearly do not do this bilaterally, but we do this together. And yes, I think we are, as far as anything that concerns the nuclear industry, I think we're very clearly committed to stop that.
Yes. And you're home to the IAEA as
yes,
well.
of course. So we'll see. We just saw the first reports on the delegation that came back, and they had just said it was a good visit. We'll have to find out and see what that means. No idea.
Let me move you closer to home and ask for your thoughts about Russia, and particularly Mr. Putin's perpetual presidency or almost presidency.
Yeah.
How does the Russian situation look from Vienna at this point?
No, what you can see, I think, is that things have changed enormously. It's certainly not up to me to judge this or that Russian leader, but the fact is that we had, if you remember, during the Yeltsin years, almost a complete breakdown of central power in Russia with some very negative consequences. Putin then came in and restabilized the situation, I think very much to everybody's acceptance and benevolent acceptance at that. And it now may seem like with many politicians of a certain generation that the time may be passing him by slowly. But as you say, I mean, I had the honor of assisting at a number of meetings with him, and he sees himself really as the first servant of the country. He's informed in incredible detail about projects that are going on, and he's probably dealing with too many things at once and trying to sort of, like Peter the Great, reconstructing the whole
Yes.
country. So, he's not that sort of, far from reality tyrant that just wants to consolidate his own rule. I think he firmly believes that he's doing this for the good of the country. And of course he knows from first-hand experience how difficult it is to run such a big country on the resources it has. So far, the restructuring efforts have not really been all that successful for many reasons, and of course because it's easier to sell raw material and energy than getting things going. But I think that what you're facing now is that the economic crisis has hit Russia as well, and people are getting upset. I don't think this is as much about so-called civil liberties and stuff like that. This is like many of these new street movements. This is because people are unhappy with their life, with their real life chances and possibilities. It's a little bit like the Occupy movement that we see here. And in European countries, it's a bit like the Arab Spring in that sense, that it's too easy to put just one label on this and saying this is about freedom and human rights and we want to elect whoever we want. I don't think that's the case. In Russia, historically, the leader has to provide. If he cannot provide enough, then people are upset. And this may be the problem that they are facing currently, whether for Putin doesn't really matter as much. But the question is, what is the alternative? And it might well be then, some of the oligarchs or whatever, and whether that would be an improvement. It's an open issue.
Okay. One last question, and it ties directly to what you've been talking about, and that is, obviously Austria has long played an important role in the United Nations, but Austria was elected to the United Nations Human Rights Council. I think that's a 3-year term through 1914 or 2014, excuse me. So, how does Austria see its role in that forum? Its opportunity to, if not take the lead, at least to push for certain kinds of human rights initiatives.
No, I think this is, we've had traditionally a very, very strong engagement in UN human rights discussions and development of new instruments. So it is the first time that we're serving on this reconfigured council, but we've served on the predecessor for many, many years. So there is a long experience there. It is high on our priority list. Has been every time I remember my own years at the UN in New York. That was always one of the core parts of our participation at General Assembly. So this is very close to our hearts, and we are particularly focusing on a couple of issues, which is children's rights in general, and on the other hand, freedom of expression and protection of journalists and stuff like that, and of course women in armed conflict, children in armed conflict, all these classic issues that we've been fighting for also during our years on the Security Council until 2 years ago. I mean, we were serving on the Security Council recently. Yes. So we see this as an extension of what we did there. We've always held that for a small country, even if we are now part of the European Union, but for a small country, the work in the multilateral organizations, but particularly in the UN framework, is a very good multiplier of the effort. You can do things there. You can find friends and co-sponsors and whatever in a multilateral context that bilaterally you could never achieve. And that's where we engage very much, and where we have sent some of our top people to Geneva to follow this, in particular where the minister himself goes as often as he can to these meetings. We focus on these issues, but again, this is not new, it's not special, it's just that we are putting a little more of our resources into this while we serve on the council. But those are issues that highlight every one of my colleagues wherever we serve are following very, very closely. Fortunately, it's not really here necessary here in the United States.
But some of those issues are not the trafficking issue, the children's rights issue. There's a new protocol on the rights of the aging and rights of the elderly.
That'll be interesting. That'll be interesting. Yes. I mean, personally, I'm not sure whether the creation of new instruments really helps a lot on the ground. But yes, we are faced with new issues.
Yes.
But, it's I think the devious way of human rights activists to try and end war by creating so many regulations. It's impossible.
Well, you put your finger on the critical issue, which is how you move from the language of the covenants to the actual action on the ground and making a difference.
Absolutely. The one problem that I see with our work, I mean, not also but the Western work in a lot of human rights driven areas, from children, women's rights, cultural, whatever, is that we are, of course, in those areas very, very highly developed. And I compare it to a Gothic cathedral. We are sitting right up there on the spire, carving the last finials and stuff like that, but others haven't even built the basement yet. And there is this discrepancy because, of course, our activists are pushing for more, which is normal. You move forward, you try to get more, you try to be more specific, more detailed, and so forth. So you start to dividing. You have now. See, maybe we will have different children's rights by age group. I don't know. Babies and primary schoolers and high school. I don't know. Maybe that will come. I'm not belittling the effort. I'm just stating that the gap is growing, and the risk that I'm seeing politically is that this is the gap where the wedge of so-called cultural diversity is driven into, where some radical Islamic movements and others keep telling us, no, we hold the key. This is not universal anymore. We're not talking about universal human rights. These are Western human rights. And once we move there, we're going to lose the battle. I'm absolutely convinced, because this is the key point that we should never lose from sight, and I know that our colleagues certainly don't do that. The universality of human rights, that's the key.
Yes. Well, on that insight, let me say thank you, Mr. Ambassador. You've been very generous with your time and with your thoughts. And again, let me thank you for watching on the website for Diplomatic Connections. Please join us again as we meet with other ambassadors and leaders around Washington and in the diplomatic community. This is Jim Winship saying thank you. Please come back for Diplomatic Connections.